In 1939, a self-taught archaeologist knelt in a Suffolk field and brushed away soil to reveal the ghost of a ship. 86 feet long, its wooden hull completely dissolved, leaving only a perfect impression pressed into the sand like a fossil. At its center was a burial chamber packed with more treasure than had ever been found in a single grave in England. An iron helmet with a face like a mask, Byzantine silver, 37 gold coins, a sword with a garnet-studded hilt. And where the body should have been, there was nothing. No bones, no skeleton, just a human-shaped gap in the dirt, exactly where a king would have lain. Nearly 90 years later, scientists are still finding new evidence at this same site, and still arguing about who, or what, actually vanished from that grave. This is Sutton Hoo. In the summer of 1939, with war against Germany just weeks away, a landowner named Edith hired a local archaeologist named Basil to investigate a cluster of ancient burial mounds on her Suffolk estate near the River Deben. Brown had no university degree. He was a farmer's son and self-taught excavator, recommended to by the Ipswich Museum because no formally trained archaeologist was available on short notice. Working largely alone at first, with a couple of estate workers assisting, Brown began excavating the largest of the mounds, known simply as Mound 1. Early on, he found something that told him this was no ordinary burial. A line of iron rivets curving gently through the soil in a shape unmistakably like the hull of a ship. As he continued, careful never to disturb the fragile soil itself, the full outline emerged. An 86-foot vessel, its timber completely rotted away in Suffolk's acidic ground over 13 centuries, leaving behind nothing but a perfect negative impression, like a fossil cast in sand. Word of the find reached London quickly, and by the time full excavation resumed with professional archaeologists that summer, it was already clear this was one of the most significant burial sites ever found in Britain. Then, just weeks after the treasure was fully documented, Britain declared war on Germany, and the finds were rushed into storage in a London underground tunnel for safekeeping through the Blitz, their full study delayed by nearly a decade. None of this would have been found at all if not for two people the history books nearly left out. Edith was born into wealth and had travelled as a young woman to Pompeii, to the pyramids at Giza, to the tombs of Luxor with her father, who was himself an amateur excavator of a ruined abbey on his own estate. She married later in life, and when her husband Frank died in 1934, grief drew her towards spiritualism, a fascination common among wealthy Britons of her generation, and that same curiosity eventually turned toward the ancient burial mounds sitting quietly on her own Suffolk property. In 1937, she decided to have them investigated, and the Ipswich Museum recommended Basil, a farmer's son with no university training, but a growing reputation as a careful, self-taught excavator. Brown spent 2 full seasons on the mounds before uncovering the ship in 1939. But the moment word of the discovery's true scale reached London, professional archaeologists led by Charles Phillips of Cambridge took over the dig, and Brown was largely sidelined from excavating the treasure-filled burial chamber itself, a task that instead fell to Phillips's own team, including the archaeologist Peggy Piggott. It would take decades for Brown's foundational role to be properly recognized in official accounts of the discovery, though Phillips himself privately admitted, in his own words, that Brown's excavation work had been perfect and could not have been better done. For her part, donated every single object from the find to the British Museum without keeping a single piece for herself, and declined the national honour she was offered for it. Both her generosity and Brown's overlooked skill are now permanently commemorated at the site. But for years, popular credit for one of Britain's greatest archaeological discoveries went almost entirely to the professionals who arrived only after the hardest and most delicate work was already done. In 1986, a local dive tour operator named Kihachiro Aratake was scouting new sites off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island, Japan's westernmost inhabited island, closer to Taiwan than to mainland Japan. Looking for a good spot to watch hammerhead sharks, he instead found something that stopped him: a massive rock formation rising from the sea floor in what looked unmistakably like tiered steps. Word spread quickly through Japan's diving community, and within a few years, the site had a nickname that stuck: Japan's Atlantis. What made it more than just a striking dive spot was its geometry. Divers reported flat terraces, straight edges, and corners that met at what looked like deliberate right angles, the kind of shapes people associate with construction, not erosion. What made Sutton Hoo's ship burial so remarkable wasn't just that a ship was there. It's that reconstructing it required archaeology to essentially invent a new technique on the spot. Because the wood itself had vanished entirely, Brown and later excavators had to read the ship's shape purely from the stain it left in the sand and the pattern of surviving iron rivets. Over 3,000 of them, each marking where a wooden plank had once been fastened to the next. From that pattern, archaeologists reconstructed a clinker-built vessel. Overlapping wooden planks, a design tradition shared with later Viking ships, powered by around 40 oarsmen, with no mast or sail evidence found, suggesting it was built for coastal and river travel rather than open ocean crossings. The ship had been hauled up from the river nearly 100 meters uphill and lowered into a trench dug specifically to hold it. An engineering feat requiring serious manpower and planning, undertaken purely to bury a body. This kind of ship burial has close parallels in Scandinavian archaeology and even echoes the funeral described in the Old English epic poem Beowulf, where a legendary king is sent to sea in a ship laden with treasure. A literary connection that has fascinated scholars since the moment Sutton Hoo was found, because it suggested the poem wasn't pure fantasy, but reflected real funerary practices of the era it was written in. Sutton Hoo's craftsmanship didn't emerge from nowhere, and it wasn't unique in the world that produced it. Archaeologists have long compared the ship burial and its helmet to a cluster of similar boat graves at Vendel and Valsgårda in Sweden's Lake Mälaren region, north of Stockholm. Sites that have produced at least 4 helmets built in a closely related style, with the same crested ridge running front to back and stylized animal and human faces worked into the metal. The similarities are close enough that some historians have proposed direct contact, shared craftsmen, or even imported workmanship moving between Scandinavia and eastern England in this period. But the comparison also reveals something else. The Sutton Hoo helmet is demonstrably higher quality than any of its Swedish counterparts, and the ship itself is larger than the vessels found at Vendel and Valsgårda, or even Norway's famous Oseberg ship burial, discovered decades earlier and long treated as a benchmark for the entire tradition. Whatever relationship connected these cultures across the North Sea, East Anglia in the early 7th century wasn't a lesser cousin copying Scandinavian fashion. By the evidence of the objects themselves, it was producing work that outclassed much of the source material it drew from. It's one more thread in the same pattern this whole investigation keeps turning up. A kingdom historians once dismissed as a cultural backwater was, by every physical measure archaeologists can point to, operating near the top of its world. Here is where Sutton Hoo stops being simply an incredible discovery and becomes a genuine, still debated mystery. As Brown's team and the professional archaeologists who joined him reached the center of the burial chamber, beneath and among the treasure, they expected to find a skeleton. They found nothing. No bones, no skull, not even a single surviving tooth. The calcium that makes up human bone is exactly the kind of material Suffolk's acidic, sandy soil destroys fastest. For decades, this absence fueled real, serious scholarly debate rather than idle speculation. Was Sutton Hoo actually a cenotaph, an empty monument built to honor someone who died or was buried elsewhere, the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of a memorial with no body inside? Some early excavators leaned toward that explanation, since a body that leaves absolutely no trace at all seemed, at the time, difficult to fully explain through soil chemistry alone. The uncertainty stood for decades, an open question sitting at the center of one of Britain's richest archaeological finds, unresolved by anyone who had actually worked the site. It wasn't a matter of a few missing fragments either. Comparable Anglo-Saxon graves from the same era, even in similarly acidic soil, usually still yield at least trace tooth enamel or bone mineral. The completeness of the absence at Sutton Hoo was itself part of what made the question so difficult to close. The answer came, eventually, not from finding new bones, but from a completely different kind of evidence: chemistry. Later reanalysis of soil samples, taken directly from the burial chamber, detected significantly elevated phosphate levels precisely in the outline where a body should have lain. Phosphate being one of the chemical signatures a decomposing human body leaves behind in soil long after every trace of bone and tissue is physically gone. That finding effectively settled the cenotaph question that had lingered for decades. Someone almost certainly was buried at Sutton Hoo. Suffolk's soil chemistry hadn't left an empty grave behind out of absence. It had erased every physical trace of a real person within a matter of decades, leaving only a ghost written in chemical residue instead of bone. Separately, radiocarbon dating of surviving organic material recovered from the burial, fragments of textile and other organic remains resistant enough to partially survive, has placed the grave firmly in the early 7th century AD, a dating window narrow enough to line up with the reign of one specific historical figure already known from the few surviving written records of the period. The leading theory has, for decades, pointed to Rædwald, king of East Anglia, who died around 624 AD and was, according to the Venerable Bede's near-contemporary writings, one of the most powerful rulers in southern Britain at the time, exactly the kind of figure whose burial would justify a ship, a helmet, Byzantine silver, and treasure drawn from across the known world. But leading theory is doing real work in that sentence. There is no inscription at Sutton Hoo, no seal, no direct written record naming the grave's occupant. The Rædwald identification is an inference built carefully from dating, status, and geography, not a confirmed identity backed by direct evidence. Other candidates have been proposed over the decades, including Rædwald's son or other East Anglian nobles from the same narrow dating window, though none carry as much scholarly support. It's a genuinely open question that historians answer with careful hedging rather than certainty, even nearly 90 years after the discovery. Bede's account, written in his ecclesiastical history of the English people less than a century after Rædwald's death, describes him as a powerful but famously divided king, someone who kept both a Christian altar and pagan shrines under the same roof, hedging his religious loyalties the same way modern historians now have to hedge their identification of his grave. If it is Rædwald, the burial captures a king caught precisely at the hinge point between two worlds, pagan and Christian, right before Anglo-Saxon England converted for good. In January 2025, new research complicated the Sutton Hoo picture even further. Scholars analysing artifacts from the wider Sutton Hoo burial ground not just the ship grave itself, but surrounding graves at the site, proposed that some of the individuals buried there may have been Anglo-Saxon warriors who had actually served in the Byzantine Empire before returning home to East Anglia, based on the presence of Byzantine silver, inscribed spoons, and other imported items that fit patterns seen among documented Byzantine military auxiliaries elsewhere in Europe. If correct, that theory suggests direct personal connections between early medieval England and Constantinople. Soldiers who had travelled, served, and fought under the Byzantine Emperor then carried that world's luxury goods home with them, rather than treasure simply arriving through several intermediary trade steps. It reframes Sutton Hoo from an isolated wealthy outpost into a site with genuinely international, first-hand connections to the late Roman world's surviving eastern half. It's a theory that's still being actively tested rather than settled. Researchers are continuing to cross-reference artifact styles, metallurgy, and burial customs across the wider cemetery to see how many individuals the pattern actually fits. But even as a live hypothesis, it illustrates something the Byzantine silver alone already suggested. Early medieval East Anglia wasn't a closed provincial society. It was a kingdom whose people, one way or another, had genuinely been to Constantinople and back. Sutton Hoo has never actually stopped producing new evidence. In June 2024, the UK television series Time Team returned to the site in partnership with the National Trust for the most intensive excavation season there since the early 2000s, working alongside more than 80 volunteers from around the world. The standout find of that season was the base of a 6th century Byzantine bronze vessel known as the Bromswell bucket, lifted from the ground in a single, carefully preserved soil block and sent for laboratory analysis. In May 2025, researchers confirmed something genuinely unexpected about it. This luxury imported vessel hadn't simply been buried as treasure, it had been repurposed as a cremation container, holding the burned remains of a person along with animal bone, in what researchers believe may be the first confirmed use of an object like this for a cremation burial found anywhere in the archaeological record. Digging continued through a second season in summer 2025, with additional Anglo-Saxon graves uncovered elsewhere across the wider site. 86 years after Basil Brown first found those iron rivets in the sand, Sutton Hoo is still an active excavation, still generating findings that reshape what historians thought they already knew. It's hard to overstate how much a single grave reshaped an entire field. Before 1939, Dark Ages was a genuinely common label for early medieval Britain among both scholars and the public, a period assumed to be culturally impoverished, disconnected from the sophistication of the Roman world that preceded it. Sutton Hoo single-handedly undermined that framing. A society capable of commissioning a ship burial this elaborate, importing silver from Byzantium and garnets from Sri Lanka, producing metalwork that outclassed comparable Scandinavian craftsmanship, and maintaining warriors and diplomats as far away as Constantinople, was not a culturally isolated backwater. It was a wealthy, internationally connected kingdom with its own high art and its own diplomatic reach. Sutton Hoo has often been called Britain's Tutankhamun for exactly this reason. A single, undisturbed royal burial that single-handedly rewrote the assumed history of an entire era. It reshaped how historians read Beowulf, giving the poem's descriptions of ship funerals and treasure-laden halls a real archaeological anchor, and its story was significant enough to be dramatized in its own right in the 2021 film The Dig, bringing Basil Brown and Edith Pretty's overlooked partnership to a global audience for the first time. It remains, to this day, one of only a handful of early medieval royal burials ever found undisturbed by looters anywhere in Europe, which is exactly why archaeologists keep coming back to dig more, nearly 9 decades after Basil Brown first knelt in that Suffolk field. A ship that dissolved into a perfect ghost of itself. A widow and a self-taught digger who found it and very nearly weren't credited for it. A grave built for a king whose body vanished without a trace, identified only by chemistry and careful inference. A treasure hoard that rewrote what historians thought Anglo-Saxon England even was, connected not just to Scandinavia, but all the way to Constantinople. And an excavation that 86 years later is still finding new questions faster than it answers old ones. Sutton Hoo isn't finished with us yet. Subscribe, because History Decoded is where the real answer replaces the comfortable one.